Alexander Gray had everything money could buy: gleaming sports cars lined up in the marble garage, rare paintings adorning his walls, and a mansion so vast that even footsteps echoed like whispers of emptiness. Yet, despite his empire, he was a man plagued by mistrust. Wealth had made him powerful, but it had also made him paranoid. Too many betrayals had carved scars into his heart: business partners who siphoned profits, relatives who smiled at his table while plotting behind his back, and even employees who took advantage of his generosity. So when Isabella arrived at his door as the new maid, he studied her the way he studied competitors: sharply, cautiously, waiting for cracks to appear. She was quiet, polite, and worked diligently, never asking questions or seeking attention. But Alexander didn't believe in appearances. He had learned long ago that masks often hid greed. That night, in the solitude of his study, he sat before the towering steel safe embedded in the wall. Inside lay a fortune: bundles of crisp cash, sparkling jewels, and confidential documents. He stared at it, fingers tapping the polished mahogany desk, wrestling with an idea that had simmered in his mind since Isabella's first day. If she's truly honest, he thought, this will prove it. Slowly, he turned the dial, the metallic clicks echoing in the stillness. With a final twist, the heavy door swung open, revealing treasures that could change any ordinary person's life overnight. He deliberately left the safe slightly ajar, its contents visible to anyone passing through. For a moment, he paused and looked around the dimly lit room, as if the walls themselves would judge him. This was not just a test for Isabella, it was a test for himself, to see if he could still believe in the possibility of good in others. As he walked away, he cast one last glance at the open vault. The glittering diamonds reflected the chandelier's light like watchful eyes. Closing the study door behind him, Alexander murmured to himself, almost bitterly, "Let's see what kind of person you really are." That night, he barely slept. The mansion felt even colder than usual, and the silence of the corridors pressed against him. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him hoped she would fail, because if she did, it would confirm what he already believed, that everyone had a price. Yet another part of him, fragile and long buried, wished desperately to be proven wrong. The following morning, sunlight spilled into the study through tall windows, illuminating flecks of dust that swirled in the air like tiny secrets. Isabella wheeled in her cleaning cart, humming softly to herself, the melody faint but comforting in the cavernous silence of the mansion. She had grown accustomed to the grand rooms, though she never stopped feeling small within their vastness. As she dusted the shelves, her eyes drifted toward the far wall. For a moment, she froze. The massive steel safe stood open, its heavy door slightly ajar, like the mouth of a beast daring someone to step closer. Inside, stacks of crisp currency and glittering diamonds caught the morning light, casting a silent invitation. Her heart skipped a beat. A wave of unease washed over her, her pulse quickening. "Why is it open?" she whispered to herself. She set down her duster and approached slowly, her footsteps hesitant on the polished floor. Isabella had never been this close to wealth before. The sight was dizzying, almost surreal. A single bundle of those bills could pay her debts, secure her brother's education, and free her from endless hours of scrubbing floors. For the briefest moment, she imagined what it would feel like to reach inside, to hold a future she never thought possible. But just as quickly, shame flooded her. She pulled back, her hand before it even moved forward. "No," she whispered firmly. "This isn't mine. It never will be." Her mind flashed with images of her brother, his hopeful eyes, his dreams of becoming a doctor. What example would she set if she took what wasn't hers? She thought of her mother's words, etched into her memory since childhood: "A clean heart will feed you longer than stolen bread." Taking a steadying breath, Isabella carefully pushed the heavy door closed until it clicked shut. But she didn't stop there. She pulled a small notepad from her apron pocket, tore out a sheet, and scribbled a few words in her delicate handwriting. Folding the note neatly, she placed it on top of the safe. "Sir, you forgot to lock this. Please be careful, Isabella." She stood there for a moment, staring at the note, her chest rising and falling with quiet determination. Then, with the gentleness of someone handling something sacred, she picked up her duster again and resumed her work. To anyone watching, it would have seemed like nothing had happened at all. Yet inside Isabella's heart, the safe had become more than a container of wealth. It had become a mirror, showing her the person she truly was. In the dim glow of his private surveillance room, Alexander Gray sat rigid in a leather chair, his eyes fixed on the monitors before him. The screen in the center displayed the study, his sanctuary, his trap, and his test. He had installed cameras years ago, not out of vanity, but out of fear. Trust was a currency he no longer believed in, and technology was the only loyal ally he had left. That morning, he had woken earlier than usual, restless, his mind replaying the thought of the open safe. His heart, though hardened by years of deceit, beat faster as the time came for Isabella to clean the study. The moment arrived. On the screen, he saw her push the cleaning cart inside, humming faintly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, holding his breath. Would she notice? Would she take the bait? When Isabella's gaze fell on the open safe, Alexander felt the tension coil in his chest. Her body froze. She hesitated. Slowly, she stepped toward it. Alexander's lips curled in a bitter half-smile. There it is, he thought. The hesitation. The curiosity. Just like the rest of them. She stood before the safe, eyes fixed on the bundles of cash, her hand twitching faintly as though tempted. Alexander's jaw clenched. He knew this scene too well, people pretending to be loyal until temptation stripped them bare. He leaned closer, his fingers gripping the armrest, waiting for her to betray herself. But then, she stopped. Instead of reaching inside, she exhaled shakily and stepped back. To Alexander's astonishment, she pressed the safe door shut. His brows furrowed. He leaned closer still. She wasn't stealing, she was securing it. And then she did something that left him completely silent. She pulled out a small piece of paper, scribbled a note, and left it neatly on the safe. On the monitor, Alexander read her words. Sir, you forgot to lock this. Please be careful, Isabella. For a moment, the CEO sat frozen, as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His cynical smirk dissolved into something unfamiliar. He replayed the footage again, eyes tracing her every movement, her hesitation, her restraint, her decision. It wasn't greed he had seen. It was conscience. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a laugh that was half disbelief, half relief. His chest felt strangely lighter, his lips curving into a faint, genuine smile. How long had it been since he had last smiled without calculation? Isabella's small act had cracked something inside him. For years, he had believed honesty was extinct in the world he lived in. And yet, here she was, a simple maid with nothing to her name, choosing integrity over fortune. Alexander turned off the monitors but sat there for a long while, staring into the dark screen. The loneliness that had wrapped itself around him for years didn't feel quite as heavy now. For the first time in a very long time, Alexander Gray allowed himself to hope. The evening air in the mansion was heavy with silence. The long corridors, lit by soft golden lamps, seemed colder than usual as Isabella made her way to the study. She had been summoned by Alexander Gray himself, a rare occurrence. Her stomach churned with unease. Maids were rarely called into his private domain unless something was wrong. When she stepped inside, Alexander was already seated behind his grand mahogany desk. The safe loomed closed against the wall, a silent witness to the moment. Isabella clasped her hands in front of her apron, lowering her gaze respectfully. You wanted to see me, sir? She asked softly, her voice carrying a faint tremor. Alexander didn't answer at first. Instead, he slid a small slip of paper across the polished desk toward her. She recognized it immediately, it was the note she had left on top of the safe. Her eyes widened. Do you know why I called you here? His tone was calm, measured, but his gaze was sharp, piercing straight into her. Isabella swallowed, her pulse racing. Because of the safe. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Yes. Tell me, Isabella, why didn't you take anything? The question hung in the air like a trap. Her breath caught. She had never been asked something so blunt, so dangerous. Slowly, she forced herself to speak. Because it wasn't mine, sir, she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. And what doesn't belong to me will never bring me peace. Alexander studied her closely, searching her face for cracks, fear, lies, greed, anything that might betray her words. But what he saw was sincerity. Her eyes, though tired from long hours of work, carried a quiet strength. You could have changed your life in a single moment, he pressed, his tone harder now. No one would have known. Not even me. Do you understand that? Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I would have known, sir," she whispered. "I would have carried the weight of that choice for the rest of my life. And no amount of money is worth losing my soul." The room fell silent. Alexander's fingers tapped slowly against the desk, a habit of his when deep in thought. He had heard 1,000 excuses from people who betrayed him, but never words like these. They weren't rehearsed or clever, they were raw, unpolished truth. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Who taught you to think like that?" Isabella smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "My mother, sir. She used to say, 'A clean heart will feed you longer than stolen bread.' I believe her." Alexander sat back, struck by the simplicity of her answer. Something in his chest ached, a place he thought had long turned to stone. For a moment, he didn't feel like the untouchable CEO, but like a man staring at something he had lost years ago: innocence, honesty, faith in people. "Thank you, Isabella," he finally said, his voice low, almost weary. "You may go." She bowed her head and quietly left the study, her footsteps fading into the corridor. Alexander remained alone, staring at the note still resting on his desk. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of trust, fragile but real. That night, the mansion felt strangely alive. The chandeliers glowed warmer, the air carried the faint aroma of roasted herbs and wine, and for once, Alexander Gray wasn't eating alone. Isabella had been startled when the butler informed her that the master requested her presence at dinner. She had hesitated. Maids didn't dine with CEOs, but the message was clear: it wasn't a request, it was an order. With nervous steps, she entered the lavish dining hall. The long oak table gleamed under golden light, set with fine china and crystal glasses. At the far end sat Alexander, no longer the stern figure behind a desk but a man waiting in silence, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit. "Please," he said simply. She sat at the opposite end, feeling the weight of the grandeur pressing down on her. The first few minutes were thick with silence. The clink of silverware against porcelain echoed too loudly in the vast room. Isabella nibbled cautiously at her food, afraid to speak first. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "How long have you been working like this?" She looked up, startled. "As a maid, sir." "Almost 6 years." "6 years," he repeated thoughtfully, swirling the wine in his glass. "And before that?" Her gaze dropped to her plate. "Odd jobs. Sewing, cleaning, selling bread in the market. Anything to survive." He tilted his head. "You're young. You should be studying, enjoying your life. Why burden yourself with so much work?" A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Because someone has to. My younger brother has dreams bigger than I ever dared to have. He wants to be a doctor. Every penny I earn goes to his education." Alexander's fork paused midair. There was no bitterness in her voice, no complaint, only pride. For a moment, he envied that selflessness. He had spent his life building an empire, but for whom? No one waited for him at home. No one looked at him with the gratitude Isabella's brother surely gave her. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Do you not have dreams?" She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Dreams are expensive, sir. I traded mine a long time ago. Now my dream is to see him succeed." Alexander studied her face, the tired eyes, the roughened hands, the posture of someone used to standing for hours. Yet beneath it all was a resilience that humbled him. He thought of the people he surrounded himself with, executives who smiled in his presence but sharpened knives behind his back, friends who only cared for the glitter of his wealth. "You're remarkable," he murmured before he could stop himself. Her eyes widened. "I'm just a maid, sir." He shook his head slowly. "No. You're more honest than anyone I've met in years." The words slipped out heavier than he intended. A silence fell again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable, it was thick with unspoken truths. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir inside him: connection. He leaned back, setting his glass aside. "Do you know what it's like, Isabella, to have everything and still feel nothing?" Her brows furrowed. "Loneliness, sir." "Yes." His voice cracked slightly, surprising even him. "I built all of this." He gestured at the grand hall, the glittering chandeliers, the endless wealth surrounding them, "and yet I eat alone every night. I sleep alone. I trust no one. What is the point of fortune when your soul is bankrupt?" Her chest ached at the raw honesty in his tone. For a moment, she didn't see a powerful CEO, she saw a man who was desperately tired, desperately human. She spoke softly, almost like a whisper. Then perhaps, sir, what you're missing isn't more wealth, but someone who sees you, not your money. The words lingered between them, echoing louder than the finest crystal or richest wine. Alexander stared at her, struck silent. No board member, no so-called friend had ever spoken to him with such disarming truth. That night, as they finished their meal in quiet companionship, the walls Alexander had built around his heart began, just faintly, to crack. Weeks melted into months, and the mansion, once a mausoleum of silence, began to feel different. Alexander noticed it first in the little things, the faint sound of Isabella humming in the kitchen, the careful arrangement of fresh flowers in the study, the warmth of a home slowly seeping back into walls that had long been cold. She never changed her ways. Honest, diligent, and reserved, Isabella remained the same maid she had been on her first day. Yet to Alexander, she was no longer invisible. Each act of her sincerity shone brighter than the glitter of his diamonds. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, Alexander called Isabella into the study. She entered cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting another task. Instead, he gestured for her to sit. On the desk lay a sealed envelope, its edges pressed crisp and neat. Isabella, he began, his voice carrying both weight and warmth, you once told me you gave up your dreams so your brother could have his. Tell me, what does he study now? Her face lit with quiet pride. Medicine, sir. He's in his 3rd year. He works so hard. He wants to heal people. Alexander nodded slowly, then slid the envelope toward her. Open it. With trembling fingers, Isabella unfolded the letter inside. As her eyes moved across the page, her lips parted in disbelief. It was an official scholarship approval, full tuition, living expenses, books, everything her brother would need to finish his education. The sponsor's name at the bottom was Alexander Gray. Her breath hitched. Sir, I don't understand. This is everything. Alexander leaned forward, his gaze steady. This isn't charity, Isabella. This is gratitude. Gratitude for showing me that not everyone has a price. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, faith. This is the least I can do in return. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. You've changed our lives, sir. I don't know how to thank you. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. You already have. For a moment, silence filled the room, but it was no longer heavy. It was a silence of understanding, of two souls who had crossed the chasm between wealth and poverty, loneliness and loyalty. From that day forward, the mansion no longer felt like a prison of glass and marble. Alexander, though still a man of great power, began to see life differently. He spoke more gently, he listened more often, and he carried himself not just as a CEO, but as a man who had finally remembered what it meant to trust. And Isabella. She continued her work with the same humility, though her heart beat lighter now, her burdens eased. She was no longer just a maid in a millionaire's mansion, she was the reason a broken man had found healing. The safe still stood in the study, locked as always, its treasures untouched. But Alexander knew now that his greatest treasure wasn't hidden behind steel and numbers. It was standing right in front of him, in the form of a humble woman whose honesty had restored his soul. For the lonely CEO millionaire, it was not the wealth he had built, but the heart he had discovered, that marked his true fortune.